They said the kid was spiraling, that a toy wouldn't do a damn thing, and to get out of the way. The words cut through the corridor as alarms chirped and shoes squeaked on polished tile. A child's panic attack detonated in a hospital hallway, and everyone with authority froze. They waved off the night worker with the mop cart, insisting he'd only make things worse, while a powerful VIP watched from behind security glass. But he didn't argue. He reached for a tiny wind-up toy like he'd done this before. Minutes later, the same people who dismissed him would be staring. Because the crisis obeyed him, not their credentials. This wasn't about a toy. It was about dignity under pressure. Before the exact moment when the toy's ticking synced her breathing and the cameras caught everything, there was this: a quiet man standing where power never looks. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. What was really happening beneath the surface wasn't chaos. It was pattern and breath and fear looking for a hand steady enough to meet it. He stood still when others rushed. That was the contrarian snapback. No defiance, no apology. Evan Calder, a night orderly and single father, kept his shoulders loose, eyes soft, palms open. He didn't raise his voice to compete with the echoing corridor. He didn't ask permission from people trained to say no. Calm wasn't an act, it was muscle memory. The grounding came from somewhere older than this hospital. He felt the weight of the toy in his pocket and the familiar ache behind his sternum that arrived whenever children cried. His son's laughter lived in that ache, and so did the promise he'd made after the funeral: never let panic steal a child if his hands could stop it. The corridor smelled of disinfectant and hot electronics. The lights hummed. Security radios crackled. The girl's breaths hitched like a car failing to turn over. He noticed the pattern no one else did. The main part of the night began where the intro ended, with him stepping into the edge of the scene without being invited. A cluster of staff formed a half-moon, white coats and badges flashing, as if credentials could build a bridge. The VIP tour had paused behind glass, donor smiles brittle, cameras angled. Somewhere beyond the wall, a woman with the posture of command watched with her arms folded, jaw tight. Victoria Halden, board chair, accustomed to decisive rooms, measured outcomes like line items. She expected order to respond to instruction. The child didn't. Lena Moore curled inward, small hands clawing at air, eyes darting for exits that kept moving. Someone reached for a clipboard. Someone else called for medication. Each step closer raised the pitch of her breathing. The man with the mop cart shifted his weight, placing himself not between authority and the child, but between fear and the floor. He knelt slowly, knees complaining, and angled his body sideways to look smaller. A nurse whispered that protocols mattered. A resident murmured that optics did. He heard them as weather, not commands. He reached into his pocket and felt the ridges of plastic worn smooth by years of use. He wound the key once, careful not to let it click yet. He waited for the next breath to fail, then rolled the toy across the tile so it stopped just short of the girl's shoe. The sound was soft, a patient ticking that cut through the noise like a metronome. Heads turned. The toy shuddered and walked in place, absurd in the fluorescent light. Someone scoffed. Someone swore under their breath. The girl's eyes snagged on the movement. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. He didn't touch her. He didn't crowd. He matched his own breathing to the toy's rhythm, slow and visible, and let the silence do the work. Behind the glass, the VIP leaned forward. Security cameras tracked the motion automatically, red lights blinking awake. A guard's finger hovered over a radio button, uncertain. The ticking filled the corridor between announcements. The girl's breaths began to space themselves, still sharp, but less panicked. The man nodded once, encouragement without pressure, and nudged the toy again so it traced a small, predictable arc. A supervisor stepped in front of him, blocking the view, saying they needed control. He shifted an inch to keep the girl in sight and stayed where he was. Control wasn't the goal. Safety was. The child reached out, fingers brushing plastic. The ticking slowed. Her eyes closed for a beat and opened again, focused this time. The moment held. Not resolved, not yet, but balanced. People realized they were holding their breath. The woman behind the glass lowered her arms. The mop cart stood forgotten, handle leaning like a witness. Somewhere, paperwork would try to reassert itself. For now, the only thing that mattered was a small rhythm finding a frightened chest. The man didn't smile. He watched for signs, counted silently, ready to adjust. The crisis hadn't ended, but it had found a door, and everyone could see who'd opened it. The ticking softened, then stalled, and no one moved to break the fragile calm. The girl's breathing had slowed enough to count, and the corridor felt suspended like a held note. A nurse finally exhaled. Someone whispered that it was working. The man stayed kneeling, eyes level, hands resting on his thighs as if this was exactly where he belonged. Security cleared their throats. The supervisor recovered first, stepping back into authority with a clipped reminder about procedure. The word protocol floated like a shield, meant to reassert control. He nodded without looking away from the child, acknowledging the sound rather than the command. The toy sat between them, silent now, a small promise kept. Behind the glass, Victoria Halden straightened. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. A single gesture brought an aide closer. This wasn't how donor tours were supposed to pause. Her hospital ran on predictability, on the reassurance that expertise wore the right uniform. The sight of a night worker anchoring a crisis unsettled something she hadn't planned to feel. The girl shifted, uncurling an inch at a time. A tear slid down her cheek, leaving a clean line through flushed skin. He mirrored her movement by leaning back slightly, giving space, making it clear she was leading now. The corridor noise crept back in, the distant ding of an elevator, a cart rolling, a muffled announcement. But it no longer swallowed her. A resident tried to step in with a clipboard, eager to reclaim usefulness. He lifted a finger gently, not to hush, but to pace. The resident stopped, confused by the calm refusal. The child looked up, eyes meeting his for the first time, and nodded as if agreeing to a plan she understood without words. That was when the question started. Why him? Who authorized this? What if something went wrong? Each question arrived late, chasing a moment already passing. He answered none of them, because the answers would distract. He watched for tremors, for the shallow hitch that meant panic could surge again. He rolled the toy back with a careful flick, restarting the rhythm. The girl followed it with her gaze, breath sinking, shoulders loosening. A camera whirred as it adjusted focus. The red light blinked steady. A guard murmured into his radio that the situation was stabilizing. The words spread down the hall, changing the way people stood. Relief carries weight. It makes room. Victoria stepped out from behind the glass. Her heels sounded decisive on tile as she approached, the crowd parting instinctively. She took in the scene with a practiced scan. Child calmer, staff uncertain, a man kneeling with a toy, and filed it under risk. She asked, measured and cool, who was in charge here. No one answered immediately. The pause irritated her more than defiance would have. Finally, the supervisor gestured toward the kneeling figure, voice hedging. He didn't look up. The girl did, and her fingers tightened around the toy as if it were a life raft. Victoria crouched to the child's level, softening her tone, offering assurances polished by years of boardrooms and galas. The girl's breathing sped up, shoulders tensing again. He saw it instantly and adjusted, slowing his own breath, tapping the tile twice to reestablish the count. The child's eyes flicked back to him, relief immediate. The woman froze, surprised by the rejection. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. He stayed present, letting the rhythm do its quiet work. The woman rose slowly, recalibrating. She had money, influence, access to the best doctors in the city, and none of it mattered in this narrow strip of floor. When the girl finally spoke, it was barely audible, asking if the toy could stay with her. He nodded, and only then did he smile, a small, unguarded curve. Someone handed over a blanket. The crisis slid another notch toward safety. The supervisor cleared his throat again, this time with less certainty. Paperwork would follow, questions, perhaps consequences. The man felt the familiar tug of worry in his gut, rent, groceries, his son waiting for a story at home, but he didn't let it show. The job had never been the point. As staff began to disperse, murmurs followed him. A nurse whispered that she'd never seen it done like that. A guard wondered aloud how he knew what to do. Curiosity replaced dismissal, a subtle but meaningful shift. If you're still with me, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this turns. Because moments like this never end where you expect. The corridor returned to motion, but something fundamental had changed. The cameras kept recording. The woman with power kept watching. And the man who worked where power never looked stayed exactly where he was, steady as the last of the panic drained from the child. The corridor resumed its pulse as if nothing monumental had happened, but the air held a residue of attention. He rose carefully once the girl was settled with a nurse, knees stiff, palms tingling from the cold tile. The toy remained in her hands, a small victory humming quietly. He backed away without ceremony, giving space, already feeling the gravity of eyes tracking him. Victoria Halden didn't follow him immediately. She stayed with the staff, issuing instructions that restored order on the surface while her gaze kept drifting toward the service hallway. Control had been regained, at least administratively. Emotionally, she felt off balance. She'd seen crises resolved by specialists, by teams, by money marshaled at speed. She hadn't seen one dissolve because a man with a mop cart understood fear better than her entire apparatus. He returned the cart to its alcove, the wheels squealing once before he corrected them. The familiar motions grounded him. He wrung out a cloth, wiped a spill someone else had ignored, reset the space. Work had a way of absorbing excess feeling. Still, the quiet buzz under his skin wouldn't fade. Cameras had been on. That mattered. A nurse caught up to him near the supply room, breathless from more than walking. She thanked him, then stopped herself, glancing around as if gratitude were contraband. He shrugged it off, not unkindly. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to say she'd seen panic attacks like that escalate into restraints. "You saved her," she said, and moved on before he could respond. He ducked into the staff restroom and splashed water on his face. The mirror reflected a man older than his years, lines etched by night shifts and single parenting. He thought of his son, of the toy's twin still at home, and of the promise stitched into every routine, get back in one piece. The worry returned, sharper now. Attention was a double-edged thing. Out in the hall, the aftermath took shape. A supervisor typed furiously on a tablet, framing the incident in language that minimized deviation. Security compared timestamps. A resident replayed the moment in his head, frustrated by how little his training had helped. The institution's reflexes kicked in, searching for containment. Victoria watched all of it with a strategist's eye. She requested the footage, not as an accusation, but as due diligence. The request landed with weight. In her world, reviews led to outcomes. She didn't yet know which outcome she wanted, only that ignoring what she'd seen would be a mistake. The girl's mother arrived, pale and shaking, and folded her daughter into an embrace. Tears flowed freely now, relief loosening what fear had locked. The child held up the toy and spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other. The mother looked around, searching for the person responsible. Fingers pointed toward the service hallway. He hesitated when the mother approached, gratitude radiating from her like heat. He accepted it gently, deflecting praise, focusing on the child's steady breathing. The mother insisted on learning his name. He gave it, then redirected her to the nurse, careful not to center himself. It was easier that way. A security officer lingered nearby longer than necessary, curiosity overriding protocol. "You military?" he asked, casual but sharp. He met the question with a neutral look and a shrug that said maybe, maybe not. The officer smiled, unconvinced, and walked away with a new puzzle. By the time the cart was parked and logged, whispers had spread. Not accusations, yet, but questions. How did he know to do that? Where did he learn it? The tone had shifted from dismissal to intrigue, a subtle current moving through the labor zones. It made him uneasy. Victoria finally approached him near the service elevator. She kept her distance, professionalism intact. She thanked him for helping and asked if he'd be willing to write a brief account. The request was framed as routine. He agreed, because refusing would look like guilt, and because truth had nothing to hide. As the elevator doors slid open, he felt the tug of class contrast keenly. She belonged to the upper floors, to glass and art and views. He belonged to basements and corridors and the quiet hours when things broke without witnesses. For a moment, the elevator offered a shared space, neutral and humming. She studied him as the doors closed, noticing details she'd missed before, the steadiness of his hands, the way he listened more than he spoke. She wondered, not for the first time that day, how many assets her institution overlooked because they didn't wear the right badge. The elevator stopped at her floor. She stepped out, pausing to say they'd be in touch. He nodded, watching the doors close again. As the elevator descended, he exhaled slowly, counting the seconds like breaths. Back on his level, the hospital felt louder. Work resumed, but something had shifted irreversibly. The cameras had seen him. Power had noticed. And while the crisis had been resolved, the reckoning it triggered was just beginning. The review request landed before his shift ended, sliding into the system with the bland neutrality of an automated notice. He read it twice, feeling the weight settle in his chest. Incidents rarely ended cleanly for people in his position, and attention invited scrutiny. He finished his rounds anyway, mopping where the shine had dulled, emptying bins, resetting rooms to calm. Word traveled faster than policy. In the break room, conversation stalled when he entered, then resumed with a different pitch. A nurse asked if he'd slept at all. A tech offered coffee he didn't take. Nobody said the word hero. They said careful things, hopeful things, as if he might disappear if named too clearly. Upstairs, the footage played on a wall-sized screen. Victoria watched without interruption, arms folded, the room quiet except for the soft tick that survived in the recording. She rewound twice, isolating the moment when authority faltered and a small rhythm prevailed. The optics bothered her less than the insight. Calm had outperformed command. Legal advised restraint. Communications suggested a statement emphasizing teamwork. Operations flagged a deviation. She listened, then asked a single question: had anyone else recognized the signs in time? Silence answered. She closed the file and asked for a fuller picture of the man in the hallway. The morning brought emails. Training department circled. HR drafted language. Down in the labor corridors, he signed out and caught the bus home, the city blurring past as he replayed the night. His phone buzzed with a missed call from school. His son's teacher had questions about pickup tomorrow. Life pressed in, indifferent to institutional churn. At home, he reheated leftovers and listened to a story about a spelling test, nodding at the right places. He didn't mention the hospital. He wound the toy's twin on the table and watched it wobble, counting the ticks until it stopped. Sleep came late, shallow-threaded with corridors and glass. By the next shift, the hospital felt altered. He sensed it in the way doors opened quicker, in the way eyes lingered then darted away. A supervisor asked him to stick close to pediatrics just in case. He agreed, recognizing the hedge. Preparedness could be praise or prelude. Victoria arrived without entourage, walking the service route deliberately. She wanted to see what the cameras missed. The labor zones told a story of their own: scuffed floors, taped labels, quiet competence. She stopped short when she saw him restock gloves, movements economical. She introduced herself by role, not title, and asked if he'd walk her through what he noticed first. He spoke plainly, describing breath patterns the way sound and light can flood a nervous system. He avoided jargon. He avoided credit. He framed it as care. She listened, truly this time, noting the absence of ego. When she asked where he learned it, he paused just long enough to be honest without opening doors. Experience, he said. Their conversation drew an audience despite itself. A resident hovered. A nurse pretended to check supplies. The imbalance was visible, but so was the bridge forming. She thanked him again and said the review would be fair. He nodded, knowing fairness was a promise, not a guarantee. The day turned busy. A code blue echoed from another wing, pulling attention away. He moved where needed, steady in small ways that rarely register. In pediatrics, he knelt to a child's level to explain a noise. In the hall, he fixed a squeak that had annoyed staff for weeks. Competence, unremarkable until it isn't. Late afternoon, an email pinged across departments announcing a temporary review of panic response protocols. His name wasn't in it, but the subtext was clear. Change was being considered. That both relieved and frightened him. Systems resist mirrors. Victoria convened a small meeting at dusk, inviting witnesses and skeptics alike. She wanted facts on the table before narratives calcified. As chairs filled, she felt the unfamiliar pull of accountability not as optics, but as duty. The hospital's reputation mattered, but so did the truth. He took a seat near the door, posture neutral, ready to leave if asked. The toy stayed in his pocket, a quiet anchor. The crisis had passed, but the test ahead would be public, procedural, and unforgiving. He breathed, counted, and waited, aware that the calm he'd offered a child would be demanded of him next. The room settled into an expectant hush as screens warmed and files opened, the hum of systems asserting themselves. He felt the familiar edge return, sharpened by responsibility rather than fear. Whatever came next would ripple outward, touching jobs, policies, and how people were seen. He stayed ready, grounded, and present. The doors closed softly behind them, and the building seemed to hold its breath with him. Still waiting. The screen lit up with the corridor frozen mid-motion, a still frame of tension that made the room lean forward. He recognized the angle immediately, the security camera that always ran a few seconds slow. Victoria nodded once, and the footage rolled. The meeting didn't start with blame. It started with silence, the kind that settles when people realize something they believed about order might be incomplete. The child's panic replayed without sound at first, her shoulders rising, hands fluttering. The room absorbed it differently this time, stripped of urgency, studied like a specimen. When the audio came on, the ticking cut through. Several people shifted in their seats. He felt the toy in his pocket, heavier now, as if aware it had become evidence. The clip showed him kneeling, showed the supervisor stepping in, showed the woman with power crouching and standing back again. It showed what worked. A resident cleared his throat and spoke about protocols. A manager added context about risk. He listened, breathing evenly, eyes on the screen rather than the speakers. He wasn't here to argue theory. The footage already had. Victoria asked a single question that landed like a pivot. Why did the child respond to the rhythm? Heads turned toward him. He waited a beat, then answered plainly, explaining grounding without the buzzwords. Predictability reduces fear. Matching breath lowers panic. Giving control back restores safety. Someone asked where he learned that. The room leaned in again. He felt the old instinct to deflect, to keep his past folded small. But this wasn't about him alone anymore. It was about whether the institution could learn. He said he learned it in places where panic killed if you let it run unchecked. He didn't say uniforms or deployments. He didn't need to. The implications settled anyway, spreading quietly. A nurse's eyebrows lifted. A security lead nodded, recognition flickering. The symbolic weight of the toy shifted then. It wasn't childish anymore. It was a tool, humble and precise, wielded with intent. The room saw it too, the way an object could bridge worlds, his son's bedtime and a hospital corridor intersecting at exactly the right moment. Victoria asked for the footage to be replayed at half speed. She watched the child's shoulders drop, the timing of his breaths, the way he moved back when the girl leaned forward. It wasn't accidental. It was trained. Legal tried again to frame it as exception. She held up a hand. Exception, she said, that saved a child. That stopped escalation. That avoided restraints. Her gaze moved around the table. What was the cost of ignoring that? The conversation turned. Not abruptly, but unmistakably. From what he'd done wrong to what the system had missed. From deviation to opportunity. He felt the knot in his chest loosen a fraction. If you're finding this meaningful, take a second to subscribe. You won't want to miss how this changes things. The reminder landed softly, a pause rather than a pitch, and the meeting rolled on. A training director asked if he'd be willing to help adapt a module. He hesitated, then agreed, careful to keep expectations realistic. He wasn't asking for a title. He was offering a bridge. Victoria watched him closely, noting the lack of triumph. That mattered. She asked about his availability, about boundaries. He answered honestly, mentioning his son, his schedule, the limits he needed respected. She nodded, absorbing the personal stake that anchored his calm. The symbolic object came back into play when a manager asked why a toy, of all things. He reached into his pocket and set it on the table, winding it once. The ticking filled the room again, gentler here, almost tender. He said it belonged to his kid. He said it worked because it was predictable, because it was small enough not to threaten, because it met fear where it lived. No one laughed. A few people smiled, the kind that carries humility. The toy stopped ticking, and the room exhaled together. By the end, action items filled the board. Review protocols, pilot training, recognize contributions appropriately. There would be paperwork, debates, resistance. He knew that. But there would also be a record now, a public acknowledgement that couldn't be erased quietly. Victoria closed the meeting by thanking him again, this time in front of witnesses. She didn't apologize, not yet, but she acknowledged the gap between authority and insight. It was a start. As chairs scraped back and people filtered out, a nurse touched his arm and said her nephew had panic attacks. Could she share what he'd explained? He said yes, of course. That was always the point. He picked up the toy and slipped it back into his pocket, the plastic warm from the table. The victory wasn't loud. It didn't come with applause or promotion. It came with something sturdier, recognition that his calm belonged in the room, that what he carried from his past and his home had value here. Outside, the corridor hummed with its usual noise. But when he passed, a few people met his eyes and nodded. Not deference, respect. He felt the ground under his feet steady, like a rhythm finding its mark again. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, clusters forming and reforming like eddies after a passing ship. He lingered near the door, letting the current move around him. The toy sat heavy in his pocket, a reminder that attention, once earned, didn't simply fade. It followed. Victoria remained behind, gathering her notes with deliberate care. She watched him wait rather than leave, noted the instinct to stay available without inserting himself. When the room cleared enough to breathe, she asked him to walk with her. Not to the boardroom, not to the executive floor, but down the corridor where the crisis had happened. They moved side by side, the hospital alive again with its usual rhythms. She asked what he'd felt when the girl first panicked. He answered honestly, describing the split-second assessment, the choice to slow instead of rush. He spoke of fear like weather, unpredictable but readable if you knew the signs. She listened, uninterrupting, something in her posture loosening. At the corridor's midpoint, they stopped. The tile gleamed now, scrubbed clean of last night's chaos. She gestured to the space, asking what the staff could have done differently before it escalated. He pointed out noise, crowding, the way authority can amplify panic when it corners. None of it sounded accusatory. It sounded useful. A supervisor joined them, tentative. He braced himself, expecting pushback. Instead, the supervisor admitted he'd misread the situation and thanked him for stepping in. The apology was awkward, incomplete, but real. It mattered more than he expected. Victoria took note of the exchange. She asked the supervisor to document what he'd learned, not as a confession but as a guide. The request reframed accountability as growth. The supervisor nodded, relief visible. As they continued, staff slowed to watch them pass, curiosity replacing suspicion. A nurse offered a small smile. A tech whispered something to a colleague. The shift in perception was subtle but unmistakable. He felt it like a change in air pressure. They paused near pediatrics, where the girl now sat coloring with a volunteer. She looked up and waved, holding the toy aloft. He waved back, heart tightening. The volunteer whispered that the child had asked for the ticking man twice and settled when told he was nearby. Victoria saw it all, the bond formed without ownership or spectacle. That was when the realization landed fully for her. The crisis hadn't been solved by authority bending the situation to its will, but by someone stepping down into it. Money hadn't mattered. Status hadn't mattered. Presence had. She asked him, quietly, what he needed to keep doing this work. The question surprised him. He considered the practicalities: schedule flexibility, protection from retaliation, a voice when safety was at stake. He said as much, measured, careful not to overreach. She nodded, already thinking in systems. They reached the service elevator, the same one from the night before. The doors opened with a familiar chime. She hesitated, then stepped in with him, choosing the same level instead of her own. The elevator descended, humming softly. Inside, she acknowledged what she hadn't said earlier, that she'd underestimated him, that the institution often equated value with visibility, that this had been a blind spot. The words weren't dramatic, but they were deliberate. He accepted them without triumph, understanding that change rarely arrived as a single apology. When the doors opened, she stepped out into the labor zone and looked around with new eyes. She thanked him once more and said she'd ensure the review resulted in tangible changes, not just praise. She meant it. He could hear that. As she left, he leaned against the wall for a moment, grounding himself. The adrenaline finally ebbed, leaving fatigue in its wake. But beneath it was something steadier, a sense that the ground had shifted in a way that might hold. Later that shift, an email circulated outlining immediate adjustments, quieter routes for pediatric transfers, optional sensory tools stocked in carts, a pilot training led by staff with lived experience. His name appeared in a footnote, credited simply. No fanfare. Enough. He returned to work, resetting rooms, fixing small things. The victory wasn't complete, but it was active, unfolding. The crisis had been resolved, and now its lesson was spreading, carried by policy and practice rather than rumor. As he clocked out, a guard clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Good catch, man." He smiled, tired and genuine. On the bus home, the city lights blurred again, but this time the reflection in the window looked different. Not elevated, grounded. At home, his son asked if the toy had gone on an adventure. He nodded and wound it once on the table. The ticking filled the room, calm and predictable. The boy matched his breathing without being asked. The world outside would keep testing him, the institution would resist and adapt in equal measure. But tonight, the crisis was behind them, and the quiet victory, earned without shouting, felt real enough to trust. The next shift began without ceremony, which was how he preferred it. The hospital didn't announce turning points, it absorbed them, folded them into routine until they either stuck or were forgotten. He pushed the cart through the same corridors, noticing the subtle differences, the way staff paused to let him pass, the way conversations didn't stop anymore. Attention lingered, but it had softened. Not everything shifted smoothly. In a small office off the main hall, two managers debated wording for a memo, voices tight with concern about precedent. He overheard fragments as he refilled a dispenser, scope, liability, consistency. The old reflexes were still alive, pressing to reassert control. Change, even good change, made people nervous. He stayed out of it, focusing on work. The floors needed care. A spill near radiology had been ignored for an hour. He handled it, methodical, letting the rhythm steady him. The toy remained in his pocket, unwound, present. He didn't need it now. Calm had settled deeper than sound. Victoria convened another meeting that afternoon, smaller and less formal. This one included staff from the labor corridors as well as clinical leadership. She positioned it as listening, not decision-making. That framing mattered. People spoke more freely when outcomes weren't immediately on the line. He was invited but not required. He went anyway, taking a seat near the wall. Stories emerged. Near misses, escalations that could have gone differently, moments when intuition had been overridden by optics. The pattern was clear. Fear traveled faster when authority crowded it. When it was his turn, he spoke briefly, emphasizing preparation over heroics. Tools stocked before crises. Permission to slow down. Respect for signals that don't fit checklists. He watched heads nod, watched defensiveness ease into consideration. This was the long work, quieter than a corridor victory. Afterward, a resident caught him in the hall, asking if he'd be willing to mentor on recognizing early panic cues. He hesitated, aware of time and boundaries, then suggested a group session instead. Shared knowledge scaled better than one-on-one. The resident agreed, relieved. Not everyone welcomed the shift. A supervisor pulled him aside later, voice low, cautioning that visibility came with risk. He listened without bristling. The warning wasn't malicious. It was survival advice learned the hard way. He thanked the supervisor and said he'd be careful. That night, the hospital tested its new resolve. A transport bottleneck near pediatrics raised voices and quickened breaths. Staff caught it early this time. Someone dimmed lights. Someone else cleared the hall. He watched from a distance as the response unfolded without him. It worked. Pride flickered, unexpected and quiet. Victoria observed the same scene from farther back, noting the difference. Systems were learning. She made notes, thinking in weeks and months instead of minutes. The crisis had catalyzed something she couldn't afford to let fade. At home, he felt the accumulated fatigue settle in his bones. Dinner was simple. Homework sprawled across the table. His son asked why people stared at him sometimes now. He chose his words carefully, saying that helping can make people curious. The boy nodded, satisfied, and wound the toy until it ticked itself still. Sleep came easier than before, dreams less jagged. In the morning, an email awaited him, confirmation of schedule adjustments to accommodate training sessions, assurances of role protection. It wasn't a promotion. It was stability. He exhaled. Back at work, the corridors felt less hostile. Not friendly exactly, but fairer. A nurse stopped to ask his opinion on a layout change. A guard asked if the sensory cart should include noise-canceling headphones. He offered thoughts, careful not to overstep. Influence, he'd learned, worked best when it felt collaborative. There were setbacks. A memo watered down language. A pilot program faced budget scrutiny. He didn't take it personally. Progress was rarely linear. What mattered was momentum. Late in the shift, he passed the corridor again, the site of the original crisis. The tile shone. Foot traffic flowed. No alarms. He paused, counting breaths out of habit, then moved on. The victory strategy wasn't about applause. It was about embedding calm into places built for speed. It was about making room for skills learned far from boardrooms and bringing them into the light without spectacle. He felt that taking hold inch by inch. As he clocked out, a new orderly asked him where to find supplies for pediatrics. He pointed the way, adding a small tip about keeping noise down near the corner. The orderly thanked him, earnest. Knowledge passed on quietly. Outside, evening settled over the city. He waited for the bus, hands in pockets, toy tapping lightly against his thigh. The crisis that had changed everything was now part of the building's memory. What came next would decide whether that memory mattered. He was ready to keep showing up, steady and present, for as long as it took. The pilot training was scheduled for the following week, tucked into an afternoon slot usually reserved for updates no one remembered. That alone felt like progress. He arrived early, setting out chairs in a semicircle rather than rows, mindful of how bodies reacted when boxed in. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, familiar and grounding. Attendance surprised him. Nurses, residents, transport staff, even a couple of administrators filtered in, curiosity overriding skepticism. Victoria stood at the back, unobtrusive by design. She wanted this to succeed without her shadow bending it. He didn't open with credentials. He opened with breath. He asked everyone to notice their own shoulders, their jaw, the way tension lived before it announced itself. A few people chuckled, awkward. He waited. The chuckles faded. Presence did the rest. He demonstrated with simple tools, counting, pacing, space-making. He showed how predictability calmed systems, human and otherwise. He told a brief story about a night when noise nearly cost someone their life, and how slowing down saved it. He didn't say where. He didn't need to. The room leaned in. Questions came quickly. What if a patient refuses? What if a parent escalates? What about liability? He answered with boundaries and honesty, emphasizing that this wasn't a replacement for care, but a complement. Calm created openings. Panic closed them. Midway through, he reached into his pocket and set the toy on the table. The familiar tick filled the room. A few smiles appeared, recognition sparked. He explained why it worked, not because it was a toy, but because it was consistent, because it gave the nervous system something it could trust. He invited people to think beyond objects to principles. That was the moment Victoria noticed the shift. The room had stopped looking to her for approval. They were engaged with him, with each other. The hierarchy had softened, replaced by shared problem-solving. This was the bridge she'd hoped for, built without speeches. When the session ended, the questions kept coming. A resident asked if he'd be willing to co-design scenarios. A nurse suggested adapting the approach for night shifts. An administrator asked about costs and scalability, already thinking in budgets. He answered what he could, deflecting ownership back to the group. This worked because it belonged to them. If you're still here, hit subscribe, because what happens next shows how quiet changes survive pressure. The reminder slipped in as the room transitioned, a breath between phases. Afterward, Victoria approached him with measured enthusiasm. She said the engagement exceeded expectations and asked if he'd be open to formalizing the training. He weighed the ask against his life, his son's schedule, his own limits, and proposed a structure that protected both. She agreed, appreciating the clarity. Not everyone was pleased. An email surfaced later that day questioning the emphasis on soft skills. The phrasing stung, familiar and dismissive. He read it once and closed it, choosing not to spiral. He forwarded it to Victoria with a note about addressing concerns openly. She replied quickly, thanking him and setting a meeting. The meeting was tense but productive. He listened as skeptics voiced fears about scope creep and image. When invited to respond, he framed calm as efficiency, prevention as savings. He spoke their language without surrendering his own. The resistance softened, not erased, but workable. That evening, he picked up his son from school, the toy tucked into his jacket. They walked home together, talking about a science project. The boy asked if the hospital kids liked the toy. He said yes, and that they liked the quiet more. The boy considered that, then nodded as if it made sense. At home, he checked his email once more. A calendar invite confirmed the next session. Another message thanked him for making the hospital feel safer. He sat with that, letting it land. Safety wasn't flashy. It was cumulative. The next shift tested the new approach under stress. A delayed transfer raised voices. Someone started to panic. Before he could step in, a nurse applied what she'd learned, cleared space, slowed speech, counted breaths. The situation de-escalated. He watched from across the hall, pride and relief threading together. Victoria saw it too, from a distance. She made a note not about him this time, but about the system responding. That was the real victory, skills no longer tethered to one person. As the night wound down, he returned the toy to his pocket, unwound. It wasn't needed as often now. The rhythm had spread. Waiting for the bus, he reflected on how far things had moved from that first frozen corridor. The crisis had opened a door. Preparation was keeping it open. He felt tired, but it was the good kind, the kind that follows meaningful work. The city lights flickered on. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new frictions. Change would be challenged. But there was a path now, worn just enough to follow. He boarded the bus, finding a seat by the window. The reflection showed a man still in uniform, still unnoticed by many. And yet, embedded in the hospital's pulse, his calm had found a way to last. The momentum carried into the week like a held breath finally released. Schedules adjusted around the pilot sessions, not the other way around, a small but telling concession. He felt it in the cadence of his days, in the way requests came framed as collaboration rather than command. The hospital was still itself, busy, hierarchical, imperfect, but it was listening. Not all listening sounded the same. A meeting invitation arrived from risk management, its subject line neutral enough to hide teeth. He accepted without comment and showed up early, choosing a seat near the door. Old habits died hard. Preparedness had kept him alive before. The room filled with familiar anxieties dressed in professional language. Charts appeared. Terms like exposure and precedent floated to the surface. He let them finish, eyes on hands, breaths even. When his turn came, he didn't defend himself. He described outcomes. Shorter escalations, fewer restraints, calmer transfers. He described what happened when people felt seen. The data followed naturally, drawn from the pilot's early returns. A skeptic asked if this created dependency on him. He shook his head, pointing out the opposite. Skill spread reduced reliance on any one person. That was the goal. He saw a few brows smooth at that. Systems liked redundancy. Afterward, a quiet ally emerged. A senior nurse manager pulled him aside to say she'd tried to introduce similar ideas years ago and been shut down. Timing mattered, she said, and so did witnesses. She thanked him for standing where she'd been pushed aside. He corrected her gently. He'd stood because he had to. The difference lingered between them. Victoria watched these currents with measured patience. She'd learned to recognize the moment when pushing too hard invited backlash. Instead, she anchored changes to outcomes and shared credit generously. In meetings, she cited the pilot without naming him first, letting the work speak. It protected him and strengthened the case. The symbolic object surfaced again, unexpectedly. Facilities stocked sensory kits for pediatrics, modest and standardized. One kit included a simple metronome, ticking softly when activated. He smiled when he saw it, not proprietary pride but relief. The principal had translated. On a late shift, he found himself mentoring a transport team through a tense move. He stood back as they applied the techniques, intervening only with a raised finger to pace. The patient settled. The team exchanged glances that said, "We did that." He nodded and moved on. At home, life demanded its own attention. A permission slip needed signing. A parent-teacher meeting loomed. He cooked, cleaned, listened. His son asked fewer questions about the hospital now, more about whether they could build something together. They laid out cardboard and tape on the floor, constructing a crooked bridge that held anyway. He laughed, loud and surprised by it. Resistance didn't vanish. An opinion piece circulated internally, questioning whether hospitals were becoming too soft. The phrase stung. He forwarded it to Victoria without commentary. She replied with a plan. Address it openly, with evidence and voices from across roles. Transparency beat defensiveness. The forum drew a crowd. Clinicians spoke about burnout. Staff spoke about fear. A parent spoke about relief. He spoke last, briefly, about dignity as a clinical asset. Not sentiment, asset. The room received it with the seriousness it deserved. After, a young orderly approached him, eyes bright, saying he'd never thought his instincts mattered before. He told him they always had. The orderly nodded, standing taller. The crisis that had started it all receded further into memory, but its imprint deepened. Policies shifted incrementally. Language softened. Training became routine. He noticed fewer raised voices in the halls. Not none. Fewer. One afternoon, Victoria asked him to join a walk through with a donor group, not as a prop, but as context. He declined, explaining his discomfort with spectacle. She accepted without offense and adjusted the plan. Respect moved both ways now. Late that night, another child panicked in imaging. He arrived as backup and found the team already implementing the steps. He stayed out of sight, leaning against a wall, counting breaths with them. The child calmed. No one noticed him leave. That felt right. On the bus home, he thought about how victories were often measured incorrectly. Not by promotions or plaques, but by the absence of harm. By quieter nights. By children breathing easier. The city slid past the window. He touched the toy through his jacket, unwound, a reminder of where this had begun. He didn't need it tonight. The rhythm lived elsewhere now. Tomorrow would bring new tests. It always did. But the path was worn enough to follow, and there were more feet on it than before. He closed his eyes briefly, not sleeping, just resting in the knowledge that the work was bigger than him, and that, somehow, made it lighter. Momentum met scrutiny the following morning, when an unannounced drill triggered alarms near pediatrics and imaging simultaneously. The hospital's new habits were about to be tested without warning, under observation, and with stakes that refused rehearsal. He heard the first tone, felt the old edge sharpen, and moved toward the junction where sound and fear converged. Staff flowed past him with purpose rather than panic, carts rolling, voices low. Someone dimmed lights. Someone cleared space. He recognized the pattern forming, and stayed just outside it, present but unseen, letting the system prove it could breathe on its own now together. He stopped short of the threshold and watched leadership respond, eyes tracking choices rather than faces. Victoria stood with the charge nurse, asking questions that opened lanes instead of closing them. The crisis unfolded in layers: a child startled by noise, a parent spiraling, machines competing for attention. Techniques learned in training surfaced naturally, not theatrically. Counting replaced commands. Space replaced force. Within minutes, the pitch dropped. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not ownership. This was the victory he wanted: skills distributed, credit diffuse, dignity preserved while safety returned. Observers noted compliance improved and injuries were avoided across all units. After the drill, a formal debrief convened in the same room that once weighed his deviation. Screens showed metrics trending down: shorter escalations, fewer restraints, calmer transfers. Skeptics pressed, but their questions sounded thinner now. He answered briefly, then deferred to others who had applied the methods. A resident spoke with confidence. A transporter cited a near miss prevented. Victoria summarized without embellishment, framing results as collective competence. The room accepted it. The system was learning, and learning left receipts. Policy drafts updated, training slots filled, and oversight aligned behind evidence without spectacle or favoritism anywhere across Hall's Floor's units daily hospital-wide. He felt the pressure shift toward endurance rather than proof. Success now required patience, documentation, and restraint. A late-night email tested him anyway, questioning boundaries and authority. He replied with outcomes and limits, calm and factual, then set the phone down. At home, he packed lunch, signed forms, and listened to a story about a bridge built from cardboard. The metaphor landed softly. Strength wasn't volume. It was structure. He slept knowing tomorrow would demand the same steadiness without applause. Consistency, he reminded himself, was care repeated until trust stayed under stress without compromise daily in public spaces and systems. The next challenge arrived with spectators. A donor event filled the atrium, sound ricocheting, expectations high. A child grew overwhelmed near the displays, panic rising fast. Staff moved smoothly, applying the plan. He stood back, heart quickening, trusting the process. When a parent faltered, a nurse anchored breath, counting aloud. Space opened, noise softened. The child steadied. Applause never came, and that was perfect. Victoria watched donors notice calm instead of chaos, and reputational risk dissolve quietly. Cameras captured normalcy, metrics improved, and narratives shifted without a spokesperson or spectacle anywhere that day across Hall's Floor's units, citywide attention muted. Afterward, Victoria requested a brief walk-through with communications present, not to feature him, but to explain the change. He declined appearing on camera, offering outcomes instead. She accepted and adjusted, protecting the work from personality. The message held. Safety scaled when humility led. Later, she authorized permanent adoption, tying resources to results. He felt relief more than pride. The crisis had taught the institution to listen, and the lesson was being written into policy, where it could outlast any single person. That mattered most to him and families moving forward beyond shifts, titles, and cycles within hospital walls and culture. The night settled. He finished his rounds, replaced a flickering bulb, and logged out. On the bus, he replayed the donor event not with fear, but with gratitude for the team. At home, his son asked why people clap sometimes. He said clapping isn't always right. Sometimes quiet means things worked. They wound the toy once and watched it stop. The rhythm had moved elsewhere. Tomorrow would test it again, but tonight the house was calm. He felt prepared, supported, and steady within ordinary life earned through shared practice and patience after visible change took root without a claim here tonight. Across the hospital, alarms quieted and routines held. The crisis that once froze a corridor had become a template for response rather than a cautionary tale. He didn't know how long momentum would last, only that it existed now, carried by many hands. That was enough. He slept ready to wake and do the work again, trusting that dignity, once practiced together, could endure pressure and time. Morning would arrive, bringing new noise, and he would meet it calmly with habits learned, shared, and reinforced by leaders, staff, parents alike within halls once hostile, now measured safe and humane everywhere. Morning came without fanfare, the hospital easing into its rhythm as if the past weeks had always been this way. He clocked in, checked assignments, and moved through the labor corridors with the same steady pace. What had changed wasn't his work, but how it was received. Requests now came with context. Concerns came early, not at the breaking point. It felt less like vigilance and more like trust. The formal acknowledgement arrived quietly, as these things often did when done right. An updated credential file, a note from administration confirming expanded responsibilities tied to training support, and a safeguard clause protecting his role. No title shift. No spotlight. Just clarity. He read it once, saved a copy, and returned to the floor. Victoria observed the rollout from a distance, careful not to personalize success. She'd learned that institutions failed when they confused saviors with systems. Still, she wanted the truth anchored properly. In a closed review with senior leadership, she presented his background in full for the first time: service records, training certifications, years of experience compressed into a timeline that explained what instincts alone could not. The room absorbed it in silence. Not surprise exactly, but recalibration. The night worker hadn't improvised. He'd applied a lifetime of discipline learned under pressure most of them would never face. The revelation reframed the corridor incident entirely. It wasn't luck. It was expertise overlooked because it wore the wrong uniform. When she shared the context with him later, privately, she didn't apologize again. Instead, she thanked him for choosing restraint over recognition. She admitted that many in power would have leveraged the reveal for image repair. He said quietly that the work mattered more than the story told about it. She understood then why the change had held. Word filtered down anyway. Not gossip, but respect. A guard asked him once, careful and sincere, if it was true. He nodded without elaboration. The guard said nothing else, just stood a little straighter afterward. These moments accumulated, small acknowledgments stacking into something solid. The hospital faced another real crisis that week, unscheduled and messy. A system outage stalled transfers, noise spiked, tempers flared. He moved through the confusion, not as a lead, but as a stabilizer, modeling pace and tone. Others followed. The outage resolved without escalation. Reports later noted effective de-escalation culture as a contributing factor. Culture. The word landed heavy and right. At home, the changes were quieter but just as meaningful. His schedule stabilized. He made the school meeting without rushing. He cooked dinner without watching the clock. His son noticed the difference before he named it, asking why things felt less tight. He said sometimes work learns how to listen, and it helps everything else breathe. One evening, they built another bridge on the living room floor, sturdier than the last. The boy tested it with toy cars, adjusting supports until it held. He watched, smiling, seeing the metaphor play out in small hands. Strength came from structure, yes, but also from patience. Back at the hospital, a staff bulletin highlighted the new training outcomes, citing reduced incidents and improved patient experience. Names were omitted by design. The credit belonged to teams. He appreciated that more than he expected. It meant the work wasn't fragile. Victoria prepared to address the board, not with a victory lap, but with a reckoning. She spoke about blind spots, about how proximity to power distorted perception. She used the corridor incident as a case study without names, focusing on what had been learned. The board listened. Budgets followed learning. Policy codified it. Afterward, she found him in a service hallway adjusting a cartwheel. She told him the board had approved permanent funding. He thanked her and asked how the staff were feeling. She paused, then smiled. "Better," she said. "More capable." That answer mattered most. As weeks passed, the hospital's pulse steadied. There were still crises, still hard nights, but fewer froze. More flowed. The difference was felt in the absence of restraint, in the presence of choice. He moved through it all with the same unassuming presence, aware that the true test of dignity wasn't recognition, but endurance. On a late shift, he passed the corridor where it began. The tile gleamed. The air felt neutral. He paused only long enough to note the quiet, then moved on. The crisis had given the institution a mirror. It had chosen to look. At home, his son wound the toy and set it between them. It ticked, then stopped. The boy asked if the hospital still needed it. He smiled and said the hospital had learned its own rhythm now. The toy rested, job done. He went to bed knowing the story would never be his alone. That was the point. The dignity restored wasn't about status reclaimed, but about value recognized where it had always lived. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but the foundation held. He slept with that certainty steady and earned, ready for whatever came next. The hospital no longer felt like a place holding its breath. Mornings began with noise that settled quickly, afternoons bent without breaking, nights flowed instead of snapping. He noticed it most in the smallest moments, how a raised voice softened sooner, how staff checked spacing before crowding, how children were guided rather than rushed. The change didn't announce itself. It lived in habits. He moved through his final shift of the week with quiet satisfaction, fixing what needed fixing, offering help when asked, stepping back when not. The labor corridors felt lighter, not because work had lessened, but because it made sense. Dignity had become practical. It showed up in schedules that respected lives, in policies that trusted judgment, in leadership that listened before reacting. Victoria passed him once near the atrium, exchanging a brief nod that carried more weight than words. Their roles had settled into something sustainable. No saviors, no symbols, just aligned purpose. She had learned where power failed. He had learned where it could change. Together, without ceremony, they had shifted the center of gravity. In pediatrics, a new mural went up, painted by volunteers and staff on a slow weekend. It wasn't grand. It showed a winding path with small markers along the way. Children traced it with their fingers while waiting. He watched one child slow her breathing as she followed the curve, instinctively grounding herself. No one noticed. That was the point. At home, the rhythm continued. Dinner conversations wandered from spelling tests to bridges to why people got scared sometimes. He answered honestly, saying fear was loud but not smart, and that listening made it quieter. His son accepted this as fact, winding the toy once and setting it down to tick itself still. The sound filled the room gently, then faded. The days stacked into weeks. Reports confirmed what people felt: fewer escalations, better outcomes, less burnout. The hospital became known not for a single incident, but for how it responded afterward. Visitors remarked on the calm. Staff felt proud without needing slogans. He received a handwritten note from a parent he barely remembered, thanking the hospital for seeing their child. Not him, the hospital. He pinned it on the fridge anyway, a reminder of why systems mattered more than stories. On his last shift before a rare weekend off, he walked the corridor where it all began. The tile gleamed, the lights hummed, the space held no memory of panic. He stood there briefly, not to relive, but to measure. The place felt ordinary again. That was the success. As he turned away, a new orderly asked him a question about sensory kits. He answered, showing where supplies were kept and how to use them. The orderly nodded, grateful. Knowledge passed on, intact. Outside, the city breathed around him. He boarded the bus, seat by the window, reflection calm. The toy rested in his pocket, unwound. It no longer needed to speak. The rhythm lived in people now. At home, he sat with his son on the floor, building another bridge, this one stronger, tested by weight and time. It held. They laughed. The sound was easy. This wasn't a story about a single moment of help. It was about what happens when institutions choose humility over image, when dignity is restored where it was always present, unseen. It was about a father who carried calm into a place that forgot how to breathe, and left it better than he found it. Now tell me, what should our next story be about? Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Single dad was having tea alone, until triplet girls murmured, "Pretend you're our father." Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?